the kind of tired that settles into your bones after a double shift at Luminos doesn't wash off in the shower. It follows you home, sits beside you on the bus, and whispers that you made the wrong choice, that you should have stayed, finished the degree, found a different way. Theodora Marsh had learned to ignore that whisper. She was 29 years old, and she had been ignoring it for 4 years, ever since she left her second year of her master's program in linguistics at McGill to come back to Halifax and help her mother through the first round of chemo. The second round followed, then a third. By the time her mother's prognosis brightened enough to exhale, Theodora had been at Luminos for 3 years, and the idea of returning to Montreal felt like trying to step back into a room that had already been rented to someone else. So she stayed. She learned the wine list. She learned which tables had the best acoustics and which corner by the kitchen door caused drafts in November. She learned which guests wanted to feel important and which ones simply wanted to be left alone with their food and their silence. She learned, above all, how to make herself invisible in the particular way that high-end service requires. Present without being intrusive, attentive without hovering, warm without presuming familiarity. Luminos sat on the upper floor of a converted heritage building in downtown Halifax, all exposed brick and low candlelight, and the particular hush of a room where people come not just to eat, but to seal deals, celebrate milestones, perform versions of themselves they believe money has earned them the right to perform. The menu changed with the seasons. The wine list was curated by a sommelier named Gilles, who spoke in complete paragraphs and treated every bottle like a patient requiring diagnosis. The tablecloths were starched so crisply they made a sound when you smoothed them. Theodora liked the work, most of the time. She was good at it in the way that people with exceptional memories and a natural gift for reading rooms tend to be good at things they didn't plan on doing. She remembered orders without writing them down. She anticipated needs before they were voiced. She could manage 4 tables simultaneously and make each guest feel as though they had her undivided attention, which is a skill that most people underestimate and almost no one adequately compensates. The tips were good, not enough to pay off the debt that had accumulated during her mother's treatment, but enough to keep them both in the house on Inglis Street when to keep her mother's prescriptions current, and to allow herself, occasionally, a bottle of something decent on a Saturday night. It was enough. Most nights it was enough. The party of 6 arrived at 7:45 for an 8 o'clock reservation, which was the kind of thing Theodora had come to recognize as a power move, the implicit assertion that their time was valuable enough to arrive early and expect the room to absorb them. She had the table ready. She always had the table ready. The man who entered first was the kind of man who moved through public spaces as though he had personally arranged them. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, broad-shouldered, wearing a charcoal suit that had been made for him rather than bought for him. His name, she would later learn from the reservation, was Clifton Beauregard, and he was the founder and chief executive of a real estate development firm based in Toronto that had recently expanded its interests into Nova Scotia with the kind of enthusiasm that people in Halifax had learned to regard with a particular species of wariness. Behind him came his wife, a thin and beautifully composed woman named Sylvia, who wore a silk blouse the color of champagne and the expression of someone who had long ago decided that the most elegant response to most situations was to say very little. Beside her, 2 younger men who carried themselves with the slightly over-rehearsed confidence of people who had recently been promoted beyond their experience. And at the back, nearly overlooked in the shuffle of expensive coats and louder personalities, a woman in her early 30s named Philippa, who was introduced to no one and introduced herself to no one, and took the chair at the far end of the table with the posture of someone accustomed to sitting at the periphery of rooms she had been invited into. Theodora noticed Philippa the way she noticed most things, quietly, without making a production of it, cataloguing the small details that would help her do her job. Philippa ordered sparkling water and took out her phone and then put it away again, and there was something in that gesture, the reaching and the retreating, that Theodora recognized from her own experience of being the youngest person in a room of people who had collectively decided not to see her. She didn't dwell on it. She brought the menus. She described the evening's specials, a butter-poached halibut with a saffron beurre blanc, a rack of Nova Scotia lamb with a juniper reduction, and she answered questions about the wine list with the confidence of someone who had spent 3 years paying attention to Gilles's lectures. She was professional. She was warm. She was, in the particular way the job required, invisible. Clifton Beauregard was not the worst guest she had ever served. He was not even in the top 20, but he was the particular kind of difficult that is more exhausting than outright rudeness, because it operates in the register of entitlement that considers itself manners. He sent back the bread because it wasn't warm enough. He asked for a different glass for his water without explanation. When Theodora described the halibut, he said, "Is that the kitchen's idea of creative or just what they have left?" And smiled at the men beside him in the way men sometimes smile when they want credit for wit they haven't actually produced. Theodora smiled back. She had a smile for situations like this, not false exactly, but calibrated. It said, "I have heard you, and I am choosing not to respond to the thing you actually said." The evening proceeded the way these evenings always proceeded. The wine was ordered and poured. The first course arrived and was eaten with the slightly performative enthusiasm of people who want to be seen appreciating things. Clifton held court at his end of the table, punctuating his sentences with the names of properties and percentages, and the 2 younger men laughed at the right moments, and Sylvia said almost nothing, and Philippa ate her halibut carefully and watched the room with the quiet attention of someone who has learned that observation is often the only power available to her. It was during the main course that it happened. Clifton said something to the man on his left, something low enough that Theodora, refilling the water at the far side of the table, couldn't catch the words, but she caught the shift in tone, the slight drop in register, the quality of sound that happens when someone moves from performing to conspiring. She moved to clear a plate from Philippa's end of the table, which brought her closer to the kitchen side and gave her, without any particular intention, a better angle on the conversation. Clifton was leaning slightly toward the man beside him. Theodora had privately named him the associate because he had the look of someone performing a role without having read the whole script. Clifton was speaking in what Theodora's mind immediately classified as Acadian French, not Parisian, not the careful textbook French she'd studied as a child and then refined at McGill, but the particular coastal dialect that her own grandmother had spoken, her grandmère Margot, who had grown up outside of Camp and come to Halifax at 17, and never entirely left the Cape Breton shore behind, no matter how far inland she moved. Theodora understood every word. What Clifton was saying, in the comfortable assumption that no one within earshot shared his linguistic register, was this: the woman at the end of the table, Philippa, was an auditor from their legal counsel's office who had been sent to review the acquisition files for the Dartmouth development project, and she had apparently found something Clifton preferred she hadn't found, and Clifton's position communicated with the breezy assurance of a man who has never been genuinely accountable to anyone, was that the numbers could be adjusted before the official filing, and that Philippa could be managed. Managed was the word he used. In Acadian French, the connotation was not subtle. Theodora set down the plate she was holding with the absolute steadiness of someone who has spent 4 years practicing stillness. And she straightened up, and she looked at the wall 2 feet past Clifton Beauregard's left ear, and she thought of her grandmother. Her grandmère Margot had spoken that dialect around the kitchen table for as long as Theodora could remember. Stories about the family, about the village, about the particular texture of a life lived close to the water. After she died, Theodora had found herself missing the language itself, not just the woman. She had gone back to it, the way you go back to a place you loved as a child, finding it smaller than memory, but more honest. At McGill, her linguistics focus had been on exactly this, on minority language preservation, on the way dialects carry history inside them, the way sediment carries minerals, dense and invisible until something cuts through. She knew that French, the way she knew her grandmother's hands. She finished clearing the table and walked to the service station, and stood there for a moment with her back to the room, and she thought about what she had just heard. And she thought about Philippa at the end of the table, eating her halibut carefully, and saying, "Very little." And she thought about what managed meant from a man like Clifton Beauregard. She thought about her mother's prescriptions. She thought about the house on Inglis Street. She thought about the degree she hadn't finished, and the debt she was still carrying, and the particular indignity of spending 4 years making yourself invisible for people who had never once considered what it might cost. Then she thought about her grandmother, and the way Margot used to say, "Les chiens aboient, la caravane passe." The dogs bark. The caravan moves on. She picked up the dessert menus and walked back to the table. She distributed them without comment. She recited the evening's desserts, the maple crème brûlée, the dark chocolate tart with sea salt from Mahone Bay, the selection of local cheeses. She watched Clifton Beauregard order the crème brûlée with the particular confidence of a man who expects the world to be warm and perfectly caramelized and ready exactly when he wants it. And then she did something she had not planned to do. She set the dessert menus down at the side table and turned back to the group and said, in the same Acadian French that Clifton had used, with the Cape Breton coastline in every vowel, "Monsieur Beauregard, j'aimerais vous offrir quelque chose de la maison ce soir, si vous permettez." The silence that followed was a specific kind of silence, the kind that doesn't fall so much as it drops, like something released from a height. Clifton turned to look at her. She watched his face cycle through recognition, recalibration, and something underneath both of those that was close to the look her mother had described once, after a particularly bad round of treatment, as le plancher qui disparaît, the floor that disappears. "Vous parlez," he started. "Le chiac de ma grand-mère," Theodora said pleasantly. "Elle venait de Chéticamp. On parlait comme ça à la maison." The associate had gone very still. Sylvia, at the far end of the table, had set down her spoon with a small, precise click that suggested she was following more than she was letting on. And Philippa. Philippa had raised her eyes from her dessert menu and was looking at Theodora with an expression that was not quite neutral. Clifton Beauregard recovered himself with the speed of a man who has spent his career in rooms where recovery matters. "Charmant," he said, which was the kind of word you used when you wanted to close a door quickly. "Oui," said Theodora. "Charmant." She smiled the smile she kept for rooms like this, warm, present, and hollow as a bell. "Je vais aller chercher vos desserts." She walked to the kitchen. She pushed through the door. She stood in the sudden brightness and the smell of caramelizing sugar, and she let out a breath she had been holding for considerably longer than the last 2 minutes. The sous chef glanced over at her from the pass. "You okay?" "Perfect," she said. "Table 7 wants the brulee, the chocolate tart, and the cheese for 2. She did not go back to the dining room immediately. She took 60 seconds. She had learned, over 4 years, that 60 seconds was enough, and she considered what she had done and what it meant and what would happen next. What she had done was establish that she understood what Clifton Beauregard had said about Philippa. She had not said so directly. She had simply demonstrated, in the most efficient possible way, that his assumption of privacy had been incorrect. She had handed him that information in front of his wife, his associates, and the auditor he had described as someone to be managed, and she had done it in a register so light and so professional that there was no surface for him to push back against. What it meant was that Clifton now knew she knew, and that everyone else at the table now knew she had demonstrated that she knew, and that Philippa, quiet, watchful Philippa, with her careful fork and her retreating phone, had seen the whole exchange and was almost certainly reconstructing what Clifton had said during the main course, and was almost certainly no longer willing to be managed. What would happen next was not her business. She was a server at a restaurant in Halifax, and she had 2 more tables and a side work, checklist, and a bus to catch at 11:15. She picked up the dessert tray and went back out. The remainder of the meal was polite in the particular way that rooms become polite when something has shifted beneath the surface and everyone has tacitly agreed not to name it. Clifton ate his crème brûlée. The associate drank his coffee without speaking. Sylvia ordered the cheese plate and ate it with the composed attention of someone who has long suspected certain things and has been given no particular reason to be surprised. Philippa ordered the chocolate tart and ate it slowly, and when Theodora came to clear the dessert plates, she looked up and said, very quietly, in English, "That's a beautiful dialect. Is it still spoken?" "Less than it used to be," Theodora said, "but people are working to keep it." Philippa nodded. She held Theodora's gaze for a moment, not long, but long enough. "Good," she said. "Some things deserve to be preserved." The bill came to just over $1,200, which was not unusual for a table of 6 at Luminos. Clifton put it on a corporate card without looking at the total, which was also not unusual. The tip was $20. Theodora folded the receipt and tucked it into her apron pocket and went to turn down the table for the next seating. And she did not think about the $20 in the way that might be expected, because 4 years of this work had taught her that the tip was almost never about the service, and almost always about the tipper, and Clifton Beauregard had told her everything she needed to know about Clifton Beauregard before the bread course was finished. What she thought about, instead, walking home at 11:30 through the September air with the harbour smell coming off the water, was Philippa. She thought about the way Philippa had taken out her phone and put it away again when they arrived. She thought about the careful fork. She thought about the way she had said, "Some things deserve to be preserved," with the weight of someone who was talking about more than dialects. She hoped Philippa was going to be all right. She suspected she would be. She let herself in quietly, so as not to wake her mother, and she set her bag down in the front hall and stood in the kitchen for a moment with the light on low, and she poured herself a glass of water and drank it standing at the counter the way she did most nights when she got home late. On the counter beside the kettle was a photograph her mother kept there, a snapshot from a summer when Theodora was maybe 7 or 8, sitting at her grandmother's kitchen table in Shettycamp, both of them bent over something that looked like a colouring book, Grandmère Margot's hand over hers, guiding. Theodora had always assumed it was the colouring they were focused on. She understood now, in the way that understanding sometimes arrives sideways rather than head-on, that what her grandmother had been doing was the same thing she had done tonight. Handing her something, tucking it inside her, quiet and unremarkable, something small and old and specific to the water they came from, and trusting that she would know when to use it. She turned off the kitchen light. In the morning, she would get up and go back to Luminos and smooth the tablecloths and recite the specials and manage 4 tables simultaneously and make herself pleasantly, professionally, invisible to people who would never trouble themselves to consider what she carried beneath the surface of that composure. But tonight, standing in the dark of the kitchen on Inglis Street, Theodora Marsh felt, for the first time in a long time, entirely like herself.